Hey you guys, what's cracking? Godspan here, coming at you with another deck profile. It's time for a Destined 1 deck profile at long last, and first up the line is the fastest in the universe, Destined 1 of Exceedence, Impauldio. This is the Brank 8 representative for our new Divine Skill users, and oh boy is it a doozy. Now, it's also a bit of a shocking one, because despite its very aggressive appearance, and also its very aggressive pilot in the anime for all of you anime lovers, this is actually a defensive mid-range deck. Yeah, quite shocking that. It revolves around the use of the self-improvement gauge, a new type of mechanic exclusive to Impauldio which allows you to gain defensive bonuses whenever you take a damage, as well as hit different ramping thresholds, thus making it a bit more of a mid-range slash ramp deck, if you can believe it. Now, Impauldio is not necessarily the most complicated deck in the world, but it is one that's quite straightforward and effective, and as we saw with our friend Akina, that's really all you need to be quite powerful, and I do believe this Destined one may be one of the more powerful ones of the bunch, so let's go ahead and delve into exactly why that is. So starting off in our ride line, we've got the Grade 0 Falstater. Now, little note here, you do not need a particular Grade 0 for this ride line. It asks for any Grade 0 in matter of fact, so I decided to go for Falstater because it's the one that's granted for Impauldio, so we might as well stay on brand. Now, Grade 1 is where it gets a little bit more interesting. Inno Progresse has this singular skill. Auto, when this unit is placed by running from a Grade 0, see any Grade 0, cost to reveal a Grade 3 card with Impauldio and its card name from your ride deck. Choose a System Code X-ceed token and put in your order zone. System Code X-ceed token is our order for this Brank 8 deck, and for all of you Brank 8 veterans, you already know that if it's a brand deck, it has to have a set order. However, this one's a bit unique because it is a token set order. This was first introduced with the reveal of Gale of Artex with the Escatologui token set order, and I'm glad that they expanded on it by getting us another prominent archetype using token set orders. These are quite nifty because they don't take up actual deck space in your main deck and thus cannot be bricked with. So System Code X-ceed is the core of your deck, somewhat of a pun as it is actually a metallic core based on the artwork, and it has these two skills. First off, Continuous, Order Zone. You cannot ride to Grade 3 or higher units that do not include Impauldio in their card name, and you can have Self-Improvement Gauge. The wording of this is a bit odd, but essentially it means that you, the player, actually gain the gauge. So the gauges do not go to the Order Zone, they do not go to your Vanguard, they go to you as a player, if you can believe it. Again, another very unique strategy for this very unique, one-of-a-kind deck. Now, the second skill is the meat and potatoes, and it reads Auto in the Order Zone. When a card is put in your damage zone during your opponent's turn, take one card from your drop zone and place it face up in your self-improvement gauge. If your self-improvement gauge has 3 or less, and a trigger unit was not revealed for this damage check, choose one of your Vanguards, and it gets power plus 5,000 until the end of that turn. If your self-improvement gauge is 4 or more, however, choose one of your Vanguards and give it 5,000 power until the end of that turn. This is a bit convoluted, but to put it simply, if you have 3 or less gauge and you take a damage check, if it's a trigger, you get nothing. It's just a normal 10,000 power. But let's say it's a normal unit or an order card or something to that effect, not a trigger unit, you get a 5,000 power bonus anyway. For those of you who played the mobile game Vanguard 0 during its heyday, this will be somewhat familiar to you, as whenever your Vanguard got hit in that game, you automatically got a plus 5,000 power defensive. So, almost a joke in the community, it's as if we're playing Vanguard 0 with Impauldio, as if it wasn't strange enough. However, where this effect gets really crazy is when you hit 4 or more self-improvement gauge, as now you can get 5k regardless of what you damage check. So of course it's still 5k if you hit a normal unit, but if you hit a trigger unit, you're getting a whopping plus 15,000 power defensive, thus putting Impauldio at a base rate of 28 for a single defensive trigger checked. Yikes. That is quite the hefty booty, and honestly makes MLB a little bit jealous if we're being quite real about it. So yes, System Code X-ceed is definitely the cornerstone of this entire deck. You only need one copy of it, and because it's granted you as a token order, you don't even need to put in your main deck. So it's a perfectly convenient and exquisitely powerful mechanic. Now moseying back over the ride line, we move on to the Grade 2 Doras Evoria. Now, sorry if I butchered that name by the way, it has this one skill, Auto. When this unit is rode upon by a Grade 3 with Impauldio in its card name, place the top card of your deck face up in your self-improvement gauge. Then you may choose a card for your self-improvement gauge and add it to your hand. Now this one's a bit of an interesting unit because at first blush it would be kind of cool just to put whatever you want from your self-improvement gauge to your hand as an easy free +1. However, there is a bit of an issue with this. I would actually suggest, as the deck builder, to keep the self-improvement gauge in there and not plus off it. The reason will become more apparent when we get onto the grade 3. However, you do have the choice to essentially add back any of the gauges to your hand, and this effectively means that anything from your drop zone can then mosey back onto your hand, as gauges are derived from the drop zone cards. So if you say had to pitch a very unfortunate piece earlier on, you can then cycle it back to the hand. So you have a really good choice here, and honestly, whether to add or not to add, both are fairly legitimate, so it's going to just take some experience in piloting a deck to understand what game states will demand you to add versus which ones don't. Now, we're going to go on to the big show. Big man himself, Destined one of Exceedence, Impauldio. There are 2 skills to talk about here, and they're both axe skills, if you can believe it. Now, the first one reads, active the Vanguard circle once per turn. Cost Counterblast 1. Choose 1 card from your drop zone and place it face up as a self-improvement gauge. Look at the top 5 cards of your deck. Choose up to 1 grade 3 or lower card, call it to rear circle, shuffle the deck, and until end of turn, this unit gets the following skill. Continuous on the Vanguard circle. For every 2 cards in your self-improvement gauge, all of your front row units get power plus 5,000. This is what I mean by you might want to keep the self-improvement gauge in there, because if you can hit a threshold multiple of 2, then it's better just to get 5,000 power to the front row than to get that card back to the hand, most likely, unless you bricked and don't have a lot of pieces in your hand to begin with. So this is where it becomes kind of a case-by-case basis on what you do with that grade 2 ride line skill. Regardless, this is a very, very powerful skill, one that really ties together the ramp aspect of Impauldio, as the longer the game goes on, the more power you're going to get to the front row. And since it's pretty easy to get to 4 self-improvement gauge depending on how hard the opponent hit you in the early game here, you could be looking at Persona ride numbers as soon as turn 3, even if you went first. That's quite shocking. Now, of course, as it gets later on and you add more Persona rides, this is going to be quite the nutty amount of power to the front row. However, it is counterbalanced by a quick disclaimer, which is that there is no multi-attack in Impauldio. It is strictly a 3-attack deck for now, barring some really janky combos with Gold Dog Dragon that we're not going to be including in the deck because we don't want to get more piece reliant than we already are. Now, moving on to the Divine skill here, this is also act on the Vanguard circle, and it reads, if your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, and you have 4 or more cards in your self-improvement gauge, cost Counterblast 1 and discard a card. Until end of turn, this unit gets critical +1 and drive +2. That is both simple and scary. Getting a critical +1 is already making for a pretty scary Vanguard when we include the +5k increments to the front row, but it's the drive +2 that's the really big deal here. Not only is it a +2 to your hand for defending your opponent, but the amount of drive pressure that you can get in this deck is just magnified to 10-fold. And another quick little spoiler here, our main rear guard actually has the ability to conduct drive checks on the rear guard as well. So in this deck, on a Divine skill turn, you have the maximum potential of hitting 6 drive checks in a single turn. Yowza. And if that wasn't enough, because this only requires the opponent to be at grade 3 or greater, if you went second, you can immediately burst this skill. Being able to get this plus the 10k the front row, it's almost as if you Persona rode ahead of time. So when Impauldio is called the fastest in the universe, they don't mean that for nothing. This is a unit that can get hit hard as soon as it hits the field. So let's not underestimate that. Overall, I'd say it's a pretty strong unit. However, it's the Bulwark support and most particularly the system code X-ceed set order gimmick that's really carrying it. It just gives you more resources every single turn and also the ability for some really deadly attacks and a huge front row power. So it does a bit of everything to make your offense pretty decent, but everything else is going to provide the toolboxing, the consistency, and also more of the finishing power to this deck. Now, moving on to the main deck, of course, we're going to be running 3 Persona copies of Impauldio because Personas are almost always good if you actually have a Persona-based gimmick. There's almost no deck in Standard that would not run Persona rides, especially at max copies, if I'm being real with you. Now, another grade 3 to talk about is the Flying Transformation Vinstar. Now, Vinstar is what I was referring to earlier. I alluded to a unit that could do drive checks to the rear, and this is how he does it. Continues to the rear circle. During your turn, if you have 2 or more cards in your self-improvement gauge, this unit gets power plus 5,000. And if you have 8 or more cards, this unit cannot lose drive due to the card effects. Yeah, 8 or more cards sounds really hard to get, but you could achieve this pretty quickly, perhaps even as soon as turn 4, depending on how aggressive the opponent is fighting against you, because remember, the more damage you take, the more you benefit by being able to train up and get more self-improvement. But it's the second skill that brings us all together. Auto on the rear. When this unit attacks, if you have 4 or more cards in your self-improvement gauge, so 4 or more, keep in mind, and you have not performed a drive check in a battle where your rear guard attacked this turn, cost Counterblast 1. This unit performs a drive check and it gets drive -1. At the end of that battle, bind this unit. So if you're at 4, you can get a drive on rear, but only 1 as you can't use both of them. They have a restriction to where you can only use this skill once, effectively by not drive checking from other rears. But if you have 8 or more self-improvement gauge, which, by the way, means that you're at 20k plus power to the front row. You're getting Twin Drive on top of that, and an extra little 5k bonus because more power is always better. Now, of course, it's going to bind itself afterwards, and we do not have bind zone recursion in this deck whatsoever, so once you use it, it's lost. But that's why we're running all 4 copies, so that we can keep on seeing it. And seeing it is somewhat easy, as there are a couple cards here that can tutor it out, such as Impauldio's top 5 search. Now, moving on, we got another grade 3 to talk about, which is Elbard X-striker at 3 copies. Now, Elbard is a card that's a bit looked over in the Brandgate card pool. It doesn't really interact with the set order gimmick of the nation, and it's also something that has some neat benefits, but nothing too bombastic. However, in a deck that's only going to get 1 token set order in the entire game, most likely, Elbard X-striker really shines as an easy-to-use unit that also utilizes the Soul, a resource that is hardly used at all, if you couldn't tell by the fact that Vinstar and Impauldio are both asking for counterblasts. Now, Elbard, just to quickly review, has the ability to Soul Blast when and give plus 2k and the ability to boost from the back row. This means it's effectively a plus 15k booster from the back row. You can also remove an overtrigger from the drop to give 5k to the front row, thus making your beat sticks beat even harder. It being a 15k booster is quite convenient because that means it's a great booster for both Vinstar and also Impauldio. On top of that, being able to get plus 10k power whenever your opponent hits a trigger means that even if they were able to hit a defensive against you, you could just scale beyond that. So it's quite the powerful unit. And it has 10k shield, thus you don't have to worry about running too many grade 3s, as this grade 3 is kind of the same shield value as a draw trigger in a lot of instances. So you don't really break with Elbard at any point. And as I said before, Soul Blast is criminally underused in this deck strategy. So this will be the #1 thing that you use Soul Blast for in the course of the game. Moving on to the grade 2s, we've got Nebula Violate Dragon. Some of these names are a bit tentative, but of course I'm going to be explaining the effects and you can see the art. So even if the names do change slightly, you can still be able to identify these and look them up later. Now, Nebula Ray has 2 skills. First is auto. When it attacks, you Soul Blast 1 to gain 5,000 power until end of battle. However, if your self-improvement gauge is 5 or more, it's 15,000 power instead of 5,000, even more beating. And this is a Soul Blast, something that we don't use very much. So it's quite useful that way. Now, it has a second skill as well, which also scales quite nicely. Continues on the Guardian Circle. If your self-improvement gauge is 4 or more, it gets shield plus 15,000. You thought Alden was tanky with Galements. Well, this isn't too far behind that. As long as you have 4 or more, this is a 20k interceptor. That's really, really strong. You could just throw this to the front row alongside a Vinstar, attack with it, swing really big, and then just intercept with it on the next turn, assuming that they don't get rid of it. And if you happen to drive check into it, it's hardly a brick because it's the same shield value as if you had a freaking front trigger. Funny that we have that comparison between Nebula Way and also Elbard being able to have the same shield value as effect triggers. But it's just even more to say that Impauldio is one of the tankiest decks out there, I'd imagine, especially upon release. I wouldn't be surprised if this deck would actually be able to contend with some of the big boys. However, maybe not to competitive success simply because time rules are a thing and you'll probably get a lot of double losses for just grinding it out. Still, Nebula Ray is a fantastic unit. It's got sword and shield both cranked to 10, and because of that, we're going to run at max copies. Now, the final grade 2 unit that we got here is Cranked Vendor. Now, Cranked Vendor is the hostage order searcher. Hostage orders being a order that you put in your set order zone, and you move a card from your rear circle to the Guardian Circle, and then you bind them afterwards. In this case, it's called Bustling Bleachers. Bustling Bleachers with this skill is kind of another way to get defending out there. Of course, you already have really strong interceptors, you have a lot of cards in the hand, but sometimes it doesn't hurt to just have that little extra bit of security. And again, we're only using a Soul Blast in order to go get it, so Cranked Vendor really isn't more than just a free card if we're being completely real with it. Cranked Vendor does have a secondary skill as well, where he gets shield plus 5,000 when he's moved to the Guardian Circle by the Bustling Bleachers ability, so another draw trigger-esque kind of shielder there. It's quite tanky, and also it's super convenient as you don't really use any of the set orders here, so just running 2 Bleachers and 3 Cranked Vendor make for a really sublime and synergistic little defensive gimmick you got going on, just to add a little bit more to your overall survivability. And of course, one thing about Bustling Bleachers to add before I move on is that Elbard X-striker gets 10,000 shield when your opponent hits a trigger. However, it does not have the ability to intercept. So this guy is effectively a 10k shielder from the back row that you can slide on up with Bustling Bleachers, making for a really neat combo play that the opponent might not be expecting. You can really catch him off guard with it. Now moving on to grade 1s, we've got everyone's favorite Detonation mutant Bobalmine. Now, Bobalmine is probably the best staple in the entire freaking nation, and it's because it's providing you countercharge. As we saw from Impauldio, who counterblast twice, and also Vinstar, who can counterblast every time it does its gimmick, Bobalmine is quite important here. Getting into the soul is also kind of a nice little benefit to help give you some soul. Again, we don't really need soul that much, but sometimes if you're going really soul hungry with Elbards every single turn and maybe Nebula Rays, then it might start to become an issue in the later game, right? So Bobalmine will help counteract that quite a bit. So yeah, just a good generic countercharger, enough said there. Now we got another new card, which is Spacewalk Dragon. Now, Spacewalk has the ability, at the end of the battle in which this unit boosted, if you have 2 or more self-improvement gauge, you can put in the soul to choose one of your opponent's grade 1 or less rear guards and retire it. So you got a little bit of retire here and also the ability to move to the soul. This is not the most necessary card in the deck, admittedly. However, spot removal is something that is rather underappreciated, and you could really catch the opponent off guard because they might not be expecting Impauldio to have spot removal. Of course, this is a main deck support that came with it initially, so a lot of people who studied this might be expecting this initially, but as builds will move away from it, it might be even more crucial to keep Spacewalk in there just to catch them by surprise, a la Cranked Vendor, Bustling Bleachers, Elbard style. Now, before we move on to the more typical trigger Sentinel stuff, I do want to give a quick shout out to Grade 2, which I failed to mention earlier, but it's because this one is a somewhat of a debatable spot. As you may have noticed in this deck, we have not used Energy Blast basically at all. So I opted to go for Bullet of Creation Pansmermia. This is the set 1 cycler card for Energy Blast, and I don't need to really explain what its, primary abilities do. You just play it from the Guardian Circle from hand, or you discard it and you draw a card by paying 1 the cost. However, what is interesting is it's placed on Rear Circle effect, where if you actually place it on Rear Circle, if you Persona Road, you do have the ability to either add a set order or a grade 3 that's not your Vanguard from the deck to the hand. This can get you some Bustling Bleachers, but what's more important is that this is another way of getting your Flying Transformation Vinstar to your hand, or maybe even Elbard X-striker. This is another reason why there's a lot of interconnected synchronicity with running things like Elbard, because we do have some inherent support to a grade 3 searcher here. That's why I'm going to run 4 Pansmermia, and really there's no other good way to use energy in this deck for the time being, so maxing it out is basically your only choice for the time being. I fully expect Impauldio to get more energy support in the next wave of support for it, but until then, Pansmermia is a fantastic piece of support that honestly we can't really sneeze at. Now, moving on to some more of the typical stuff, we have, of course, 3 PGs. You can choose whatever one you want. I just chose Violate Dragon and 1 Elementaria Sanctitude. It's just a typical grade 3 deck, so there's nothing wrong with just running the normal Elementaria Sanctitude. For our triggers, you've got 4 effect crits and 4 other crits. Again, just do whatever crit you want because it's Fashion Guard at the end of the day. And I decided to opt raw triggers here. This might be a little bit of a weird choice because I tend to run front triggers in a lot of my decks, but draw triggers actually make a little bit more sense here because you're getting a lot of base defensive power, meaning that oftentimes when the opponent is swinging for usually high numbers, you don't need that much shield to make up the difference when you're at a 28k base after 1 defensive trigger check. So let's say, for instance, they're swinging for 33, pretty common number there, right? And you're at 28. Just throw on this 10k shield and you're good to go. Plus, with really big shielders like your Nebula Ray already out there, you have plenty of hefty shields to go around as it is. So there's not really a lot of downside to running Ameliorate, and the draw can always help you draw into really crucial pieces like Vinstar, Elbard, Nebula Ray, so on and so forth. And then, of course, we're going to be running 4 normal heals. You can run the effect heal that gets plus 15k shield if your opponent's unit has attacked 2 times or more. That is pretty good in this format because there's a lot of restanding rear guards I've noticed. However, I decided just to go for the old reliables there because there's no telling what engagement you're going to go into, and I'd rather be safe than sorry. And for over triggers, this isn't really much of a debate. We're doing Eldobreath all the way. Being able to check Eldobreath, especially on your Divine skill turn, is super hilarious because your Vanguard's already got a critical on it as it is, and there's a lot of ways to drive check for your front row because of Vinstar as well, so it's pretty likely that you'll be able to milk that front row double up to the umpteenth degree. This is a really good deck for Eldobreath. Maybe not to the absurdity that some decks like Revidia had going for it, but this is still quite absurd in its own way. And that was the deck list. Overall, I would say this deck is actually a really strong contender. It's in the top rung of Destined 1 so far, matching Alicalibra in defensive power versus Alicalibra's offensive power for being completely straight. So yeah, for those of you guys who were interested in picking up Impauldio, you definitely will want to do so. This deck is incredible. It's unique, and also it's just so satisfying to play, especially when you're getting 6 drive checks off before the opponent could even read your cards. And future support is definitely assured for this because there is an anime character playing this in the anime, so do look forward to some updates to this deck in the future. It's not going to be a one and done thing like, let's say, a Strike deck set would have been. So yeah, Impauldio's got a lot of room to grow, but even where it is now, it's probably one of the most defensive decks in the universe out there, and because of that, I'd say it's going to hit the totem pole of decks that I would love to play and see more in the future. Anyway, if you guys did like this deck profile, then do be sure to check out my other deck profiles. I'm going to try and get some for the other Destined ones going here later on. Of course, some Destined ones are a little bit more complicated to build than others. So there may be some delays there, but I'm going to try and get one out for each of them, because otherwise, what would there be the point in doing one if we can't complete the set, right? So with that said, thank you for supporting me along with all of this, and also going to give a quick shout out to all of my members out there who have supported me by donating to the channel and also signing up for some bonuses. We've got Dread Dreamer, Kirkshaw, Shirayuki, Nodot, Ace of Games, Just Andrew, Jamie Kaslana, Samaj Stewart, Chibi Mutsume A, Dramosa, and finally Noir. And also a quick shout out to Muffin Killer, technically a grade 1, but he actually donated some subs here, so I want to shout you out again, brother, because a lot of these wouldn't be possible without you, so thank you again. And if you want to check out other kind of content aside from deck profiles, then you've come to the right place. We've got anime reactions, fight nights, discussions, the whole shebang. So go ahead and subscribe and turn on notification for next time I upload a Vanguard video. And with that said, take care, God bless.